hope many more will follow, we will see, of the Citizens Committee on the Arms Trade. Now, there are many reasons why we feel that it's important to convene this tonight, but my name is Russell-Moyle. I'm the Member of Parliament for Brighton, and I sit on the committees for arms export controls in this Parliament, and with a set of reform-minded MPs, from Chris Laws of the SNP to Catherine West, that you will hear later on in Labour, we have been frustrated, to say the least, at the inability to scrutinise arms sales and the arms trade more broadly in Parliament. Part of that is because today we were meant to be sitting, but after about 35 to 40 minutes of public session, in a session that was meant to be an hour and a half, we stopped. We stopped because the committee had failed to meet quoracy, and we sent home the HMRC and inspectors who ensure compliance, and we didn't ask them a single question. We did that because Parliament has such a threshold that for the Arms Control Committee you need so many MPs there. You need 3 MPs from 4 committees to attend. Now, anyone who knows anything about Parliament committees, it's hard enough to get 3 MPs from one committee to turn up, let alone from 4 others. So there is a physical problem with how parliamentary scrutiny is happening. But there is also a political problem. Last time the Arms Committees introduced a report on Saudi Arabia, for example, the committee split up, it never agreed its final report, there was a bust-up, and for a year and a half the committee didn't even meet, didn't even attempt to get quoracy. And that was because there was a big argument about political interest around Saudi Arabia, to be very honest. And when politicians are failing to review these things, we felt it was important to take it to the citizens of this country, to allow experts and academics to present their views, and then to allow you to make a deliberation on what your initial feelings are. And it's not about necessarily saying this is the final and authoritative view on that. That's not what we aim to do, because there will be many final and authoritative views from the different kinds of people that you get in the room. But it is an aim to try and raise that discussion, and we start taking it out. And if this is successful here, our aim is to take that around the UK. This initial pilot is funded and supported by the Andrew Wainwright Reform Trust, and thank you very much to them for supporting that. What you will hear tonight is 3 panels. One which will be around looking at the judicial review that is currently taking place, and a broader look on how the government comes to arms control decisions. The second panel, that will be chaired by Catherine West, MP, is going to look particularly at the use of British aircraft and munitions in Operation Restoring Hope, which is the official name for the process of turning Yemen into moonscape. And then there will be a third panel which will look at the way forward. One of the big stops in this agenda is often people saying, well, yes, but if we don't, someone else will do. If we don't, we'll lose jobs. So we've invited some economic experts and trade unionists, and that is chaired by Andrew Feinstein, who many of you will know, and a former Member of Parliament of the ANC in South Africa. And so we hope that you will have a better understanding of some of those issues. Throughout the evening, we have put you on different tables, and your tables say A, B, and C. And that is at a certain moment, as we break for coffee, there will be coffee and refreshments at a certain point, and we will come back, because you'll probably be needing a drink in a bit. We will ask you on a certain criteria that will be relevant for each of your letters. If you think the government should continue its licence, the licence is 05/03/2014, open individual export licence for the payway bonds to Saudi Arabia. And we'll be asking you, do you think on the three criteria that the government, some of the three criteria that the government should be checking on, whether this export licence should be maintained or should be suspended? Now, the criteria is a European-wide criteria. It is enshrined in British law, and it is meant to be the gold standard. We hear that all the time from the government. The gold standard, we've got the most robust system in the whole world. You know, kind of this jingoistic kind of flag waving, we're better than anyone else. We have a good system, but there are many other systems, and some of them are better and some of them are worse. But we will be asking you to see whether in Group A we will be asking if you think the government should not, and this is the wording the government gives, not grant a licence if there is clear risk that the items might be used in the commission of serious violations of international law. So that is why it will be useful to understand what's happening in Yemen particularly. We will be asking you in Group B to make an assessment on the impact of the proposed transfer on the recipient country and the risk that the items might be diverted to undesirable end users, terrorist organisations or individual terrorists that this government and Britain would not approve of. So that would be what we're asking you to think about in Group B. And in Group C, we will be asking you to think, should the government should take into account, among others, the record of the buyer country in regard to compliance with international commitments, in particular the non-use of force under international humanitarian law and international and non-international conflicts. So those are the three criteria that the government is meant to judge these arms sales by. And we'll be asking you to think about that as you hear the different panels. And then at a certain moment, we will break up into the groups. At panel 3, we might be, at the end of the evening, we might be able to bring it forward. Ian Waddle from the General Secretary of the Confederation of Shipbuilders and Engineers Union is attempting to make his way here. He might not make it. In the case, we will then bring the panel up earlier. If he is able to make it later, we will bring the panel back a bit. That is because we have got a crisis with Bombardier that he's having to negotiate, and now the crisis with British Steel that he is having to negotiate, and the British Steel particularly has come up at the very last moment, as I'm sure you will understand. But we are hopeful, and we will see how the evening goes. Okay, without further ado, I would like to ask our two first panellists up. We have, I'm just looking for them, we have first of all Rosa Curley, who is a solicitor. She's instructed by the Campaign Against the Arms Trade for the judicial review against the government for licensing of arms to Saudi Arabia. And on my left, I have, and I always say your name wrong, I'm afraid, Anna. It is Anna Stravinakis. Probably close enough. She is a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex, and she is one of the witnesses that has been prevented from giving evidence to the Parliament's Committee on Arms Export Controls because of the words of someone else that I shouldn't name. She is a loony lefty. She has given evidence to the 3 previous committees on arms controls, and none of the other previous chairs had a particular problem with her evidence, and she's given very good evidence to International Development Select Committee. So I will let you make your own judgment up about that. But first of all, I think I will hand over to Anna to start.
Thank you very much, Lloyd. Hi, Rosa. Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to see so many people here, having just come from the parliamentary committees that couldn't even be for it. It turns out you can't really have your cake or eat it. Sorry, in joke around the acronym of the committees. So my name is Anna Stavrianakis. I'm a senior lecturer in international relations at the University of Sussex, and Lloyd has asked me to speak about how the Committees on Arms Export controls the parliamentary system of scrutiny we have is broken, how the consolidated criteria are applied, and is there transparency in licensing. So the first question, I wanted to start with this question of, is the Parliamentary Committees on Arms Export Controls broken? How do we know that there's even a problem? Well, I would say to you that in a situation where arms exports to Saudi Arabia alone account for half of all UK arms exports that are being used in a war in Yemen, where there are multiple credible allegations of likely war crimes, in that situation, when the parliamentary committees who are responsible for scrutinising government policy and holding them to account won't put the issue on their agenda, then we have a problem. I'm not trying to determine what the outcome would be or what their position would be, but when you won't even put it on your agenda, then we have a problem. So how and why are the committees broken? I think there is one general and one specific issue. There is the general issue around the composition and status of the committees, and this is where you get into some of the seemingly boring technicalities of Parliament that actually turn out to be quite important. So the CAPE, the Committees on Arms Export Controls, are a super committee. So they are made up of delegated members from the International Development, Foreign Affairs, International Trade and Defence committees. Because they are not a standalone committee, they have a different set of powers, and they have problems like the problem of piracy that Lloyd outlined. They also suffer the problem that they cannot force government ministers to appear before them, and so there is always a last-minute scramble to see, will any ministers appear, who will it be, what is the capacity of the committees to actually ask questions of ministers about the policy that they are putting their names to. And then also that the recommendations of any committee, the committees are not binding. So in the past, in previous iterations of the committees, when they've actually been really strong and they've had a really strong chair being quite critical of the government in its formal response says, well, we beg to differ, we don't accept your recommendations, next please. So there is a problem there of politics and of parliamentary accountability in terms of the ramifications of what Parliament says. The second issue is a more specific one, which is around the role of the current chair. It is my view that the current chair is not fit to chair the committees because he has publicly espoused positions that call into question his impartiality. And I think you can also see that on the parliamentary record. He has accused NGOs of being dishonest, and you can accuse NGOs of many things, but if you're going to make that kind of claim, I'd like to see some evidence. Again, MPs bring all sorts of interests with them to the committees, and that's entirely fair and that's entirely legitimate, and there should be a range of views and there should be a range of interests on those committees. But when the chair goes on record undermining positions that are critical of government and speaking out in favour of Saudi Arabia and repeatedly, then I think we have a problem of partiality. Moving on to the question of how the consolidated criteria are applied. The government says that there are 8 criteria ranging from respect for international law to concern for sustainable development. The government says these are applied on a case-by-case basis against all licence applications. But I think there are 2 problems here. One, that we have seen in the Saudi case, is that there is extensive, active, deliberate mobilisation of doubt and ambiguity about what is happening in Yemen in order to be able to argue that any risk of weapons being used in international humanitarian law violations is not clear. And it is on that level of technicality. Yes, there is a risk, but the risk is not clear. And if there's no clear risk, then there's no reason to stop selling weapons. The second problem is that not all arms exports are assessed on a case-by-case basis against the consolidated criteria. Campaign Against Arms Trade found out via a Freedom of Information request that in 2013 and 2014, the government issued open licences for the export of paveways and storm shadows, bombs and missiles. Now, open licenses allow multiple shipments and don't have to be reported on. And that was before 2015, before this round of war in Yemen. And those licenses are extant, they are open and they are ongoing. And we have no idea how many bombs and missiles are being exported to Saudi Arabia under those licenses, because the government is not obliged to tell us. So finally, transparency. Is there transparency in arms export licensing? Well, if transparency means the release of meaningful information that allows the public to hold the government to account, then my answer is no. There's a lot of data, trust me, there's a lot of data, but much of it is meaningless without the context in which it makes sense and the ability to manage it. And the government mistakes, perhaps deliberately, a deluge of data for meaningful transparency. It took Campaign Against Arms Trade to make a browser that actually mobilises that very data that the government put out. They have produced a fabulous browser, it's available on their website, where you can use it for yourself to actually see the dates on which licenses were granted, the values, the items that they covered, the goods that were included under that. So it took a small activist group who has done significantly more for transparency than the government or arms companies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, you could argue maybe it's not the role of a committee to investigate individual licenses or to hold the government to account. Maybe it has a different role. But it was in one of the lower court cases that I hope Rosa will mention. Of course, part of the judgment said it was the job of Parliament and the committee to scrutinise these things on a political basis. And it is because of that judgment we've actually managed to push further on the committee than we maybe would have. But there is an appeal going on, and we are hoping for even more success. And I suspect you want to hear Rosa, who will be able to talk about that in more detail.
I'm glad my losing judgment was helpful for something. So my name is Rosa. I'm a judicial review lawyer, and I have the privilege of representing CAT in their case, which is a case about whether the licenses that are being granted to allow arms consent to KSA is lawful. So I have to try and strip away all the politics of what's happening in Yemen and the UK and look very, very strictly just at the rule of law and advise my client on whether what the government is doing is lawful or not. And we've taken a case to the Divisional Court in the UK, which was heard, and we very sadly lost. And it's now been given permission for appeal, and we've had an appeal hearing, and we're currently waiting for the judgment. And I thought tonight what I would try and do is explain a little bit about what our grounds of challenge are in that case, and also to explain, I think, why things are going so wrong in relation to the decision-making by the UK authorities in relation to licences. Because what the Divisional Court said was lawful, well, I think is wrong in law, but also reveals why the licences continue to be granted. So CAT took its appeal challenging two specific decisions. One is the ongoing failure by the Secretary of State to suspend existing export licences for the sale and transfer of arms and military equipment to KSA for possible use in the conflict in Yemen. And also challenged a particular decision of the 9th of December 2015. And sadly, justice is that slow. That's the decision that we are challenging, to continue to grant new licences for the sale or transfer of arms or equipment. And there are two really key grounds of challenge that I want to talk through with you. But in order to kind of explain those two arguments, I just want to spend a little bit of time explaining the law, which I hope is okay. I'll just obviously explain the bit that's relevant to our arguments. The export of arms and military equipment from the UK to Yemen is regulated by the Export Control Act. So, it's national law. Section 9 of that Act gives the Secretary of State the right to give guidance on how he's going to exercise his licensing powers. And the Secretary of State formulated and laid before Parliament guidance, which was in the form of what's called the Consolidated EU and National Arms Export Licensing Criteria. And this guidance incorporates and adopts as government policy, so all that CAT is asking the government to do is to follow its own policy. The criteria set out in the EU Common Position, which basically gives effect to the UK's obligations under the United Nations Armed Trade Treaty, as well as some of the other international obligations that the UK has signed up to. And criterion 2 of that consolidated guidance is the really key issue for our first ground of appeal in the CAT case. And that criteria says that the government will exercise special caution and vigilance in granting licenses on a case-by-case basis and taking account of the nature of the equipment to countries where serious violations of human rights have been established by the competent bodies of the UN, the Council of Europe, or by the European Union. And it goes on to say that a license will not be granted if there is a clear risk that the items might be used in the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law. The criteria makes crystal clear that the UK's economic, social, commercial and industrial interests will not affect the application of the criteria in the Common Position. And in the application of that criteria, account will be taken for reliable evidence, including reporting from diplomatic posts, relevant reports by international bodies, intelligence and information from open sources and NGOs. So this is really crystal clear legislation from my point of view and guidance. The first ground of challenge that we're taking is that, in essence, the overwhelming evidence before the Secretary of State showed that there really is a clear risk. And we put before the Secretary of State and before the court huge amount of investigations, of findings by international bodies, international officials, NGOs. We had 2 detailed investigative reports by the UN panel of experts. We had findings from UN officials. We had the European Parliament, all of which found overwhelming evidence of IHL violations. So the evidence is crystal clear. We said that the Secretary of State, in essence, failed in his approach on how to consider this evidence when he reached his decision. We used an argument based on rationality, and what we said is that rationality requires the Secretary of State to either form a view about a sufficient number of the investigations and findings that we put before him to displace the clear evidence of a violation of IHL patterns, or to accept that there was a pattern of such violations and go on to consider whether, in light of that pattern, there was a clear risk of UK supplied weapons being used in the commission of a serious violation of IHL in the future. I think that sounds such plain, appropriate, rational decision-making process. Sadly, the Divisional Court did not agree. The Divisional Court found that, in essence, because the Secretary of State had taken into account this evidence, that was sufficient. And what the appeal is trying to argue is that no, that's not sufficient. For a decision maker to make a lawful decision in relation to these applications, he not only has to consider the evidence, but he also has to reach conclusions about it. And that's what's failed to happen. The second ground of challenge relates to the user guide and relates to, in essence, KSA's approach to international humanitarian law violations. What the user guide says in relation to the member states and the country who will be recipient of the equipment says that where there's a certain violation, a pattern of violation, then the where there's a certain pattern of violations can be discerned, or the recipient country has not taken appropriate steps to punish violations, then this should give the Secretary of State cause for serious concern. And our second round of appeal basically says that the Secretary of State has to look at this issue and consider it when reaching a decision. The evidence that the Secretary of State gave to us is the government said in the correspondence that we sent on behalf of CAT that they did not know if KSA has ever done any sort of prosecution for IHL violations. It was literally that stark. And what we've said is that the Secretary of State's failure to consider, or indeed even inquire into a series of matters that are relevant, we say, to the user's guide, means the decision is unlawful. We say the issues the Secretary of State needs to consider is whether the state in question, KSA, has legislation in place prohibiting violations of IHL, whether there are mechanisms in place to secure accountability of members of the armed forces in KSA for breaches of IHL, whether KSA has ever prosecuted or disciplined an official for violation of IHL, and whether there is an independent and functioning judiciary capable of punishing members of the armed forces who violate IHL. I personally have a view on all those questions, and what we said to the court is the Secretary of State must consider them and again reach a view on those issues, inquire into them, in order to make a decision, a rational, lawful decision on whether licences can be continued to be granted. As I said, very sadly, the Divisional Court was not with us on either of those grounds, and we say the Divisional Court erred in law by concluding that the Secretary of State could discharge his duty without knowing or inquiring of any of those matters. I phoned the court today and I was told that judgment is likely to come at some point in the summer. I don't know what that means. It probably means some point before October, maybe. So I can't give you any sort of indication of when a judgment might come, but that's the current view, that we should hopefully get some sort of judgment from the Court of Appeal, which will hopefully be more positive in the next few months.
Thank you very much, both of you, and it was illuminating how it seems like the Secretary of State may have failed to reach a conclusion on these things, and how maybe Parliament is failing to reach a conclusion on some of these things. One thing that I just had a message from someone, IHL, International Humanitarian Law, what we're talking about is that generally, and I'm sure the lawyer will correct me, the targeting of civilians either recklessly, disproportionately, or deliberately. Now, it's a bit more complicated than just that, but bear that in mind. When we're saying IHL violations, we're really talking about have civilians been targeted deliberately, or through reckless acts, or disproportionately in war. And that, I think, will be important for your next panel, which is chaired by Captain West. I haven't planned questions, but I will allow two very quick questions while Catherine's coming up, if there is one. Go on.
Rosa. You stated C2 guidance, which isn't because it's C2 itself, C2 is just a statement of intent. Is that public domain?
Yes.
I'm not talking about the user's guide.
Sorry,
so the question is, the question is, Rosa cited C2 guidance, and whether that guidance was in the public domain or if it wasn't, of which I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, I can send you some links.
What we will do, by the way, with all of this, is that we have your details on record. We will make a summary of the discussions that have happened. We also want you to keep notes on the table in the brown paper or yourselves and leave them on the table. We will incorporate those notes as well, and we will circulate it around to everyone to be able to see what the thinking was on the day. So we will circulate all those extra things as well. Is there any other clarification questions? Otherwise, we will move to the next panel. Thank you.
Catherine West, Tonsia Woodgreen, Labour MP. Could I have Rowan, David, Monyan and John, please? Just need one more chair. Tommy, can I have that chair? Now, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself shortly. Just before I do, I've just been in the Labour Friends of Yemen meeting, which is next door, talking to some government representatives who happen to be in London. And I was saying that due to the pressure of civic society here in the UK, and I think due to the fact that as an opposition party, Labour does have quite a clear line on suspending arms sale to Saudi because of Yemen, it has actually made the profile of the Yemen terrible humanitarian situation go right up. And they were sort of saying that they're a bit worried about the fact that both in the UK and the US, it's a bit of a bun fight between the Democrats and the Republicans, and here between Labour and the Tories. But I said the important thing is that Jeremy Hunt, in his first month of being Foreign Secretary, actually visited Yemen, and that compared to, say, North Nigeria or West Papua or Sudan or any other human rights or conflict zone at the moment, this is very, very high up the agenda. So a big thank you to everybody here who is helping to put pressure on the government on that. Rowan, could you introduce yourself?
Yes, is this working? Yes, it is. So hi, my name is Rowan Shire. It's actually very scary to see this many people in the room who are particularly interested about Yemen, because that has changed dramatically since the start of the conflict, in which there were less people and there was more, which is encouraging. But I am currently an investigator at Bellingcat, who are an open source investigative unit. And I'm going to talk you through two different periods of times and two different cases which I'd like to highlight, because during this 10 minutes I'm going to talk about JIAT, which is the Joint Investigative Assessment Team that is being led by the Saudi-led coalition. And so the first strike that I'm going to talk you through is one that happened in September 2015 in the old city of Sana'a. And at the time I was living there and I was working as a freelancer and as an investigator for Amnesty International. And this strike is particularly interesting but not unique. And the way that it happened was at around 1 o'clock at night. We heard planes hovering above, we heard something explode, and then I heard the shrapnel fall on our roof. And after I heard the shrapnel fall on our roof, I heard the cries of our neighbours. And I live in a particularly dense area of the old city in Sana'a, where you can hear almost everyone and everything at all times. After that happened, I waited till about 5 o'clock in the morning to visit the site. And this was because we had always grown accustomed to double tap strikes occurring in Yemen, and so for investigators to almost immediately go on the site, there was a level of danger and something that could not necessarily always be afforded. Once I arrived on the site, I assessed the damage, and seeing the damage, it was consistent with an airstrike. An entire house had been ripped apart. All the houses besides that house had been blown out. And at the site, I found munition remnants that were consistent with a payway, and that were consistent with a 500-pound bomb, showing that only an airstrike could have caused this particular amount of damage. Later on during the day, as it is custom for burial to occur on the same day, I watched the family of 11 that were killed be buried. I saw their little graves being dug, and I saw their tiny bodies being carried into those graves. An entire family had been killed, 7 children, their father, their mother, their aunt, and her husband. Now, the person in question was a grocer that we viewed and saw almost every day. He sold chives and coriander. But the reason as to why I mention this strike is because JIAT released an investigation claiming that the strike did not occur, which is particularly frustrating having viewed all of this and then seeing this statement. second airstrike is one that happened in the south of Yemen in July 2015 in a market in Lach, which is in the south of Yemen. Now, the Fayouche market was particularly busy at the time. This strike was actually one that we at Bellingcat had done using open source information. And once we assessed that open source information, we saw that there were 2 impact craters and not 1, which indicated that 2 strikes had occurred and not 1. And this is particularly important because Giant also released an investigation saying that the market had not been bombed. It is very difficult to say a market has not been bombed once there are 2 impact craters and not just 1. Now, these strikes, once again, are not unique in their nature, but they are rather representative of what Giant has been saying for the past 2 years. Giant was set up in 2016 as an investigative body that is independent from the coalition, that is actually run by the coalition, to investigate such airstrikes. They've investigated a total of 175 to 180, if my figures are correct, and most of those are ones where they claim that these strikes did not occur. Very few of them they've actually taken accountability for. A good example of this is the airstrikes that occurred on the bus in Lahgan in Sada in 2018, which carried a lot of children, and the only reason why they accepted responsibility for the strike was because of the way the media handled it. Because there was so much pressure in the media, Giant claimed that this was a mistake, and because it was a mistake, they were going to recover it. Essentially what happened after that was that Giant claimed that the people would be held accountable that had conducted the strike, but so far we have seen very little accountability. Now, the work that I'm doing has shifted from running investigations on the ground from 2018 after I left Yemen into now conducting open source investigations with the team at Bellingcat, in which we've partnered with a legal NGO called Global Action Network to investigate 100 airstrikes that have occurred in Yemen purely using open source information. Now, the reason as to why this is important is because we are now trying to challenge the narrative that such strikes cannot be investigated by the government and by Giant because of accessibility, because that is what they've been telling them. That the challenge is being able to access the ground, and therefore because we can't access it, then they cannot be investigated. This is particularly important because the government relies entirely on Giant's assessments for their information. And having just showcased just 2 examples of airstrikes in which Giant claimed did not happen, this is what the government used to review assessments. Now, the aim is with these assessments that if we're able to do them, and if we're able to showcase our methodology, and show that by using open source information, you're able to assess whether an airstrike did occur, and by diligently going through and verifying that information, you can change the way the procedures are being run and try to correct the procedural flaws as the Saudi-led coalition has said that they are procedural flaws. Yeah, I think that's it.
And now we're going to move on to David. And David Waring is a SOAS graduate like myself. Are there any other SOAS graduates in here? I thought there might be. There always are. And he's just written Anglo-Arabia, Why Gulf Wealth Matters to Britain. So over to you.
So yeah, I'm a specialist in British relationship with Saudi Arabia and the Gulf States. My book is the one comprehensive survey of those relationships, which says something about how little attention we pay to them, related compared to how important they are. And it's also very reasonably priced. There's 3 points I wanted to make, and hopefully I'll get to make at least 2 of them in my 10 minutes. First is that we think about these arms sales in terms of their economic benefit often in the sort of dominant discourse around British arms sales. But the point I want to make is that arms sales are less about the arms industry and its profits, and they're more a strategic question for the British state. So when you look at the year 2015 to 16, which is a major year for British arms sales, a really extraordinary year for British arms sales, because we were sending the bombs that the Saudis were using to bomb schools and hospitals, etc., in the first first year of this war. In that exceptional year for British arms sales, they still only made up British total exports to Saudi Arabia, not just including arms, but everything, still only made up 1.3% of British total exports worldwide. So it's less about the value of those arms sales to the British economy, and it's more about the strategic value of arms sales to the British state. So the British state, since decline really set in the middle of the 20th century, since empire started to slip away, the big strategic goal of the British state internationally is to maintain its status as a global power, and it's trying to emphasise the military aspect in maintaining that status. And to be a global military power, you need to have your own arms industry. If you're buying your arms off other people, you end up in a position with the Saudis where you're militarily dependent on the people who provide your arms. So you need your own arms industry. And to have your own arms industry costs money. And if you tax the public in order to pay for building those arms, the public might start getting annoyed and saying, well, we'd rather spend those taxes on schools and hospitals. So, selling arms to countries that have the money to buy them is a good way to make economical the maintaining of the arms industry that you need to sustain your status as a global military power. If you want to do that, you've got to find people who are willing to buy. Now, since the end of the Cold War, it's one of the things my research showed, and it's represented by probably the sexiest graph in my book, which is really saying something, is what you find is that arms sales to the rest of the world over the last 25 years have consistently declined, whereas arms sales to the Gulf are going up to the point where, as Anna mentioned before, about 50% of our arms sales go to Saudi Arabia. So you need arms exports to maintain the arms industry, you need an arms industry to be a global military power, then you need to sell arms to Saudi and the Gulf states. And that's the significance of these arms sales. Rather than an economic benefit to the British economy or about jobs, it's about Britain wanting to maintain itself as a global military power. So maybe we should think about whether that's a price, this is a price worth paying for that status, and whether it should be a priority for Britain to be a global military power. Remember that the Gulf states benefit from this as well. They're not just doing charity for us. By equipping us, by helping us to equip ourselves to be a global military power, they've got us ready to step in when there's the next, say, Saddam invading Kuwait or what have you. Britain, America and France remain protectors of these states to a large extent. The global north protectors of these global south states, as they have been for a long time. So they get something out of this too. The second point I wanted to make is about the nature of these arms sales. This is not a question of we sold these arms 3 or 4 years ago and now they're being misused and it's out of our hands and it's got nothing to do with us. The Saudi war effort, the Saudi bombing is sustained by ongoing British and American support. So these contracts which the Blair government and the Thatcher government before then signed, which provide the typhoons and the tornadoes, also provide for the ongoing supply of components, spare parts, technical logistical support, training for pilots, and of course ammunition. So when they're running out of ammunition, the British resupply the ammunition they're using to hit these civilian targets. Philip Hammond said, right at the start of the war, we've got this huge infrastructure supporting the Saudi Air Force, and we will continue to supply everything they need. His precise words were, we'll do everything short of engaging in combat to help the Saudis. So we may not be combatants in this war, but the British are active participants and enablers of this war. To the point where there was a Dispatches documentary on Channel 4 a few weeks ago, they had testimony from people who've been working in this support infrastructure. And they said very clearly, if the British pulled the plug, and the Americans as well, the Saudis wouldn't be able to sustain this bombing for more than a few days or a week. So what we do in this room and the general political pressure that we're trying to generate on the government really matters. It really is a question of life and death. And if this pressure had been there 4 years ago, maybe more people would be alive now or otherwise are not, including, according to Save the Children, 85,000 infant children who are dead of preventable disease or starvation as a result of the blockade that the Saudis are imposing militarily with our assistance. So it's really significant. The third point I've got time to make it, I'll just make it quickly. And it relates to that last one. This is our violence too. It's not just the violence of the person who pulls the trigger, it's the violence of the person who provides the gun and the bullets, knowing what the person who pulls the trigger is going to be firing at. This is our violence as well as theirs. It's not a case case of noble, innocent Britain being corrupted by these beastly barbaric Saudis. There's no distinction of cultural values to be drawn between us and the West and them in the East, us as Europeans, them as Arabs or Muslims. We're on the same page and doing the same, we're involved in this violence ourselves. And I think it should encourage us to think about the nature of the British state's role in the world and the centrality of violence to British power from the days of empire right up till now. It's not just a question, it should be a question for us to focus on this policy at the moment. Also, going forward, we've got to think much more fundamentally about Britain's role in the world and what the implications are for the fact that we've enabled the creation of the world's first humanitarian crisis, and that's not been an aberration, that's been a natural outgrowth of decades of British policy.
Thank you very much, that was excellent. Welcome to John, who's just arrived. But just before you speak, John, we're going to hear from Roniel down the our technology. Give us 2 seconds just to test that we can hear you.
Hi there, can you hear us?
Yeah, can you?
Oh, great, we can hear you. Too loud, 1 minute, give me a moment. Can you just introduce yourself, please?
Hello, this is William, accountability specialist from Muatana Organization for Human Rights.
Catherine?
Thank you, that's fabulous. And on our agenda, we've got the spelling of your organisation, Muatana. So could we hear from you for about 10 minutes? And then after that, we're going to go into, hear John and then go into our groups. But maybe you can give us 10 minutes on what you found in UK and US weapons in civilian sites, and describe your work and how your work will be building evidence towards litigation.
Okay. We are a human rights organization. We work by investigation, field investigations, interviews, and we try to publish reports and other media outputs. I will try to give you a very small overview of the humanitarian situation here and what Muatana did and documented on the UK and European and US role of in the war of Yemen. The war started 5 years ago. The airstrikes began before 5 years from now. This war was supported and fueled by the US, the UK. It was conducted by the coalition, which was led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. According to the coalition, these airstrikes were targeting the Houthi rebels. But over the last years, Muatana for Human Rights, has investigated strike after strike that were targeting civilian targets. Between March 2015, that is when the strikes started, and January 2019, Muatana documented 328 coalition airstrikes in 13 Yemeni governorates. These airstrikes killed at least 3,325 civilians, including 749 children and 280 women. The attacks continued. Just a week ago, it was on Thursday morning, the 16th of May. Sana'a was hit with several airstrikes in different areas. One of these airstrikes targeted a civilian house in a very, very crowded area. So it's called Arabat Street. That strike killed 5 civilians. All of them were children. And it wounded dozens, including from the wounded also 16 children in the same neighborhood. Muatana described the situation in our country by saying, Yemenis are the victims of a fierce contest of cruelty between coalition forces and the Houthis. And that is, to me, is the most accurate description of the situation here. The US, UK, and other European countries play an important role in the Yemen war. In some instances, the UK has supported Saudi Arabia and the UAE politically and militarily throughout the conflict, including continuing to send billions of pounds worth of weapons to coalition countries, despite how these weapons are being used. The role the UK plays in Yemen affects thousands of lives daily. In 2016, I visited a community college in Yemen. I remember the witness was still really shocked when I arrived. He said that he was very disappointed, and he told me that they were about to open the college to start for the coming year, and he said, but no, it's just destroyed. If you are a young man or in Sanhan district who wants to study in university, you would now have to travel to Sana'a, which is 2 hours away. It is exceptionally difficult to build a school or a college in Yemen, and the people in Sanhan had all of their efforts wiped away in an instant. The effects of any particular airstrike or any particular unlawful attack, for that matter, go far beyond the people killed and wounded. In that airstrike, UK-made weapons were found. Muadana has documented another 5 airstrikes where UK-made weapons were also used. And those five airstrikes we were actually able to find the remnants and analyze them. And that is the case of only a tiny fraction of the many unlawful attacks the coalition carries out. It's very hard to actually find remnants after any airstrikes. So even civilians and civilian objects with UK-made weapons is a dangerous indicator. The risk that any weapons still sold will be used unlawfully is crystal clear to those of us living in and working towards a more peaceful Yemen. The road to peace in Yemen is long, and there's much that needs to be done to get there, including holding war criminals accountable and ensuring civil society is protected. The UK conflict with Saudi Arabia and the UAE would be a major first step towards peace in Yemen. So thank you for hearing me out and for being here and doing this and being part of this first step.
Thank you. We'll give you a round of applause. Very exciting to have somebody who's there, and we want to send solidarity to you in this terrible time of suffering for Yemen. And now I'm going to pass on to our final panellist for this evening before we break into groups. David, do you want to test that mic? If not, you can have this one.
Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Thanks. Thank you very much indeed. Just in terms of my relevant experience, I was a British Defence Attaché both to Saudi Arabia and to Yemen over the period of 9 years. I've been back many times since, so for an outsider, I know both Yemen and Saudi Arabia reasonably well. And also I was present at I was the only non-Arab member of the UN mediation team. I was the only non-Arab member of the UN mediation team in Kuwait during the talks between the two sides, Houthis on the one side and the Yemen government side on the other side. So it's interesting for me also seeing how they were around the table. In questions I can give some insights into that. I thought closer to them, some people outside might have given them credit for. So in terms of my own position, I'm not against arms sales as such, providing of course that they obey the rules. And I know those rules personally because I was working in our Ministry of Defence a number of years ago here in London, here in Whitehall, and I was one of those across whose desks applications to export arms to places like Saudi Arabia passed. And there was one occasion, for example, when we turned down an application to sell arms to the Saudi Arabian National Guard because they, some years before, about 10 years before, had used, in our view, a disproportionate lethal force in putting down a demonstration in the south of Saudi Arabia. So the rules are there, and they are there to be obeyed, and I have personal experience of those rules being applied. So what is legitimate in my mind is the use of force to defend against borders, across borders. So the threat that the Houthis undeniably provide against Saudi Arabia and its interests across the Yemen, Saudi Arabian border is legitimately met with force, providing the force is appropriate. What is not legitimate, of course, is laying waste large portions of the country, as you would have already been hearing today. And apart from the awful stats in terms of people rendered homeless, people who've been killed, innocent people by the bombs, and also the consequent malnutrition, cholera, dengue fever, malaria, and also another stat which people generally don't quote is some 5 million plus children not able to go to school. So of course when people talk about reconstruction, it's not just physical buildings, it's actually potentially an entire generation who's not been educated even to a basic level, and therefore the loss of intellectual capital and the whole expertise able to pull a country like Yemen out of the situation in due course from where it is now. So no amount of aid, I would also submit, with the government's other hand, through people like DFID and the aid agencies, nations, etc., to my mind, by or through the British government, enabled by the British government, absolves the British government from being complicit from its own accountability in this particular war. I would actually draw a parallel historically with the slave trade. So the good efforts of people like Wilberforce and the Quakers were actually obstructed for a number of years by the economic arguments, which therefore for a number of years hold sway over the moral arguments. And so once again, it's in this case economic interests, and I fully understand the importance of some 40% or so of the arms exports from companies like British Aerospace going to Saudi Arabia, and I respect the economic dynamic. But what I would say is when in due course, in a number of years' time, we look back on this, and things hopefully are different, it will be interesting to see whether we look back on this period in the same way as we look back on the slave trade and the way the economic arguments included the moral arguments. Other governments, of course, have shown more moral leadership than the British governments in drawing a line under arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And even in the US, albeit you could argue it's symbolic, the Senate passed a vote. So I don't expect any change today or tomorrow in terms of the British government's stance. If in the recent appeal case the British government is found to be breaching its own rules, it'd be very interesting to speculate as to what will happen then, but for the time being, today I don't see any change. But what I would say, looking back to 2015, is we should have been much more agile in terms of using almost unique relationship, which I know well from personal experience with the Saudi Arabians, in terms of both the depth and the length of duration of that relationship, to speak truth to power, rather than being concerned about the implications of being critical. And of course, on respect, diplomacy often needs to happen behind closed doors. So although now there may be more, pressure is probably too strong a word, but at least dialogue between British government representatives and senior Saudis in order to try to bring this war to a close, I would argue it should have happened a long time ago. And we should have, in my opinion, warned the Saudis, probably privately, that although we would like to continue to supply arms to them for moral and reputational and legal reasons, we would have to, and we can still say this, we would potentially have to stop supplying those arms unless they demonstrably put more pressure on their clients, i.e. the Yemen government side, to negotiate in good faith. Because again, my experience going back to the talks I was present at a couple of years ago, the negotiations at senior level were not being conducted in good faith, and yet the two sides, the actual commanders, who of course in many cases knew each other, sitting around the same table as I and my colleagues were sitting at, showed to my mind a quite remarkable, good example to politicians of how they could actually cooperate. But of course, the more senior politicians are concerned about their own constituencies, and so concessions there are more difficult. And again, the condition would have been to the Saudis, and could still be to the Saudis, ensure your clients negotiate in good faith, rather than have the sense that they have the unconditional support of the Saudis, in which case if you're the Hadi Yemen government side, why bother to negotiate in good faith at all, if you feel you have that unconditional support from the Saudis. And in the meantime, of course, the relative unprofessionalism, because professionalism is always relative, of, in my opinion, the Saudi Arabian side, plus, of course, that sense of unconditional support on the Yemen government side, means that this war has been prolonged and has gone on longer than it needs to have done, because, in my experience as a professional soldier for many years, it takes a truly professional force working to very specified ends, obeying the rules to achieve a decisive outcome. So in my opinion, looking at this war, knowing the protagonists from close up, unless efforts are made to bring this to a close, it will run and run, because none of the sides are professional enough to achieve a decisive result. So a myth I want to lay to rest, which I sometimes hear even now, is that if the Americans and the British stop selling arms, the Chinese and Russians would leap into the breach. That, of course, given modern complications, incredibly complex systems in terms of both the hardware and the software, is not the case. You can't just bring in any old bomb and strap it on an aircraft which is designed for other bombs. Certainly there's an awful lot of even more collateral damage than we've seen so far. So in summary, I would say it's all about using the levers one has available to oneself, in this case the British government, albeit behind the scenes, and I respect the fact that lots of this stuff counterproductive to demonstrate it in the open, in order to help the Saudis, help the Saudi government move up the gears more quickly to bring the war to an end. And in turn, by doing that, to encourage the Houthis on their side to negotiate in better faith, because why should they bother if they see the Yemen government side themselves not negotiating in good faith? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, David. And could you just show us the two books that you've got on the side there? Are they yours or? And those books, right. I'm just going to give you an opportunity to show off your books. And David will also tell Aaron to circulate the title of his book, because we all must support budding authors who have wonderful books on topics which we like. Lloyd, do we have time for one series of 3 questions, or do you want to move straight into panels and save the questions for later?
Well, we were wanting a quick film to show, and then the discussion was down to you guys to decide whether you felt that you needed a cup of coffee, or you could go straight into the final panel. It's your decision. Of course, if you were at an arms fair, you would have a whole luxury lunch put on and a spread, but I'm afraid we just have biscuits and tea and coffee. So I suspect probably not the question.
Right, straight into the film, and then we'll save the questions for after the film.
Yeah, yes.
Thank you, Lloyd.
صراحة ضرب شديد الصواريخ وهذا والأطفال والنساء يخافوا. قال الوالد يسأل بعد أنه مريض. نزلنا على أساس المعذور عرس أولاد عمي وهم صاروا أخوي اجتمع الأهل كامل. واحتفلنا هذاك اليوم بالعرس. وبنت الجود حصل لي موقف معها، فإذا هي تخرج من باب بيتنا وتدعي يا أبا تعال. رحت لعندها يعني أنا قلت إيش ده؟ قالت تعال أحبك قسم. فأنا استغربت على هذا الموضوع. يعني أول مرة تصيح لي لجنب البيت تلحقني إلى باب الخيمة تحبني. يعني كانت هذاك اليوم يعني قد ودعني وداع. فهذول الموقف ما نسيت منه. آخر وقت شفت فيها اللي وقت الموضوع بعدها ما اكتبت.
العرس حق ابني مرسل محمد عليه السلام والسلام. العروس بيتخرج مع الحنة كتخرج العروس، باقي اثنين اللي كانوا مستنيين للضيوف الدار. أكثر من شهر عروس متواصل. ما في حاجة، تجزع الطائرة يوميا. الممر حقها فوقنا طرف صنعاء أو تعز أو في المفرق تقريبا في المعسكر خالد، يعني طرف دائما هنا تجزع فوقنا.
نتفاجأ أن الطائرة كانت محلقة فوقنا. زفينا الله داخل البيت.
الطائرة جت من الجهة الغربية الجنوبية. أنا قلت نعم اللي يصلح الطائرة. ثانية جت من مكان ضربت حل الرجال. أجينا احنا نجري. يا نساء اخرجوا من داخل البيت لا ترجع الطائرة مرة ثانية تضرب فوقكم. أبي صارت ثانية ضربت فوقكم ثانية.
انفجار كان عنيف أغمي علي، وبعد أن صحيت من الصدمة هذا خرجت أشوف ايش الحاصل. أشوف بيت عمي بيحرق ثرى بصار في غرفة. هل داخل هذا الغرفة الحريوة بجميع حالتها. عددهن اللي توفن داخلها 16 غرفة. انتهى كانت. أحصل ابنة عمي مدفونة مع دلالة ساعة ظهر. كانت تصيح لي وتبكي أنقذها. فأنا حاولت أنقذها ما قدرتش. كان السقف يتهدد على الرجل. وأسمع أصوات النساء. كان في هذه الغرفة 18 امرأة. أسمع أصواتهم يعني بالموت مدفونة للنهاية. فأطلع الدورة الثانية لقى النساء من الحريق ينزل بالحبال نازل. والنساء كانت تكرز من الدورة الأول تكسرت وخرج المقياك والشباب حق الديوان. يعني بشكل ما تصور شيء هول. كل من كان يبحث عن أطفاله، هذا يبحث عن نساء، هذا يبحث عن أمه. محمد صار عمره 5 سنوات. وإرينا اللي هي ابنة أختي. ابنة الجود 3 أطفال كانوا يلعبون في الحوش. كانوا برفقة الوالدة. مجموعة أظن تقريبا 7 أو 8 كانوا في الحوش. العروس من ضمنهم واحد من أخواني والدي بيهربوا كلهم. يعني 3 أجساد كانوا بالذات كانوا في الحوش.
حق الأطفال الصغار جابوا واحد منهم الطفل طفل صغير كلمة وبنت زغيرة. البنت الراس حقها والطفل الثاني. هذا اللي جاب. الباقي هنا في الشجرة هذا كان داخل الشجرة هذا في الشجرة هذا اللي قلتها كلها لا أشلاء. حسيت أول ما حصل عرفت أمي فيها هنا على مرة حصلت رجلي. وأختي هي عملية في رجلها حصلت. عرفت بعدين اللي عرفتهم خلاص. أي كانت أنا مع الباقي حاطة كلهم ما شفت. أختي أولادها سعيدا حسين سعيد حسين آخر حبة عن 3 أشهر تقريبا أو 3 أشهر ونص. زوجتها سليمان علي زيد حمد، بنت أخي 26 هذول من الأسرة، 26 نفر من داخل الأسرة، كان جماعة كله كان جماعة 26. اسم جرحى ما فيش حد غيره.
القتلى العائلة ذي 18. تحول العرس إلى حزن، في البكاء والعويل في كل بيت. يعني هذا صار اللغز، ما احنا دارين ايش السبب ليش ضربونا سعودية او غيرها من المستهدف. هذا عرس يعني حاجة ما تقول شيء.
من اللي ضرب؟ إذا كان ما هي طائرة التحالف من طرف، منين أجت الطيار؟ هم حاصر لنا جو بر بحر. من فين ذات الطائرة الغربية؟ أنا أدور الحين إيش السبب من ضربونا على أي؟ والله ما يكسف لو يمديله 1000 عام وهو عنده أجهزة ويشوف إنه نساء قدامه نساء حريم. ما فيش حاجة، ما فيش معسكرات، ما فيش ولا مديرية ولا حتى مركز.
تمشي لجنة تحقيق في هذا
بدون أي احتياج. تأخذ الناس الأبرياء اللي راحوا حقهم بما يحكم بما يحكم الشرع القانون.
الآن عندما وصلوا البيت وحصلت الوالدة يعني حسيت إن الحياة خلاص أدمت بدون وجودهم، ودائما أفكر فيهم وحسين عدم عايشين. والدتي ووالدي وابنتي يجون وهي سببت لي جرح كبير فيه. ما أعتقدش إن حد شيء فرحان ترجع من أول حزن هذا ينتهي من قلبي. يعني الجرح عميق جدا. فما ندري ايش
أعاني بكربة، أعاني من جبرات الظلم المتكبرين.
Ladies and gentlemen, the organizing organisation that were responsible for that film, Watana, who we heard from earlier, are really doing quite remarkable work in Yemen at the moment. I was with some of their research team over the past few days in Berlin. They have 26 researchers in the field who are risking their lives to document the various atrocities being committed by all sides in the conflict. But the reality from the ground, in a view that is perhaps different to that which is being presented by the chair of the Committees on Arms Export Committees,
I've never covered a child's...
is that the Saudi-led coalition, particularly the Saudis themselves, and in terms of the ground war, the United Arab Emirates, are responsible for the vast majority of the violations of international humanitarian law and even possibly war crimes that are being committed with American, British, and many other European nations' weapons. As this is a citizens' committee on the arms trade, as Lloyd said earlier, can we just by a show of hands get an indication, should we go straight into the third panel, which looks ahead at the way forward, then take a break and sit in our groups for discussion, or would you prefer to take a break now? Could I ask those who would like to continue straight into the next panel just to raise their hands? And those who would prefer a quick break now?
Why don't we, if we want a quick break, quickly grab a tea and bring it?
I would suggest if you're desperate, do that. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Paul Holden and Anne Pettifor to come to the front, and we will start with this panel. Now, and as they come here, I should mention that I have two quick confessions. The first is that unfortunately, because Ian, for the reasons that Lloyd gave, has been unable to make it here, the events of the day have defeated him getting there. I've realized that all three members of this panel are born in South Africa. But at least the two people sitting on my sides are both British citizens, even if I'm not. And the second very quick confession is that you've had the previous panels chaired by two highly esteemed and wonderful members of Parliament. And I'm afraid the third panel is being chaired by what Al Gore would describe as a recovering politician. I was an ANC Member of Parliament in South Africa for about 7.5 years of our democracy, and had the misfortune to try and investigate a major corrupt arms deal in which the new democratic government of South Africa decided to spend around £6 billion on weapons that South Africa had absolutely no need of. On that deal alone, BAE Systems, according to a London Metropolitan Police figure, paid £115 million in bribes to win a contract for which they were not even shortlisted. And just to give you an indication of the socio-economic opportunity costs of this trade, because we have seen in very stark form the human costs, the direct, deadly human costs. But to give you an indication of the socio-economic opportunity costs, the money that was spent on the South African arms deal could have built 2.2 million houses in a country that has a shortfall of 2.5 million houses. Could have built well over 1,000 schools and employed teachers in those schools. Could have created 100,000 new low-entry jobs every year for 10 years in a country that has a formal unemployment rate of almost 30%. But most devastating of all, at the time that we decided to spend those £6 billion, our then President Thabo Mbeki suggested that we did not have the financial resources to provide antiretroviral medication for the 6 million South Africans living with HIV or AIDS, leading, according to a fairly conservative report by the Kennedy School of Government, to the death over the following 5 years, the avoidable deaths, of 365,000 South Africans, and the birth of 32,000 babies a year HIV positive, because we couldn't afford mother-to-child transmission treatment. But we could afford £6 billion on weapons. So with that as the context, and everything we've heard today about the arms export control failures of the United Kingdom and the impact of British arms around the world, and particularly in our era's worst humanitarian crisis, it gives me great pleasure to be joined by two, and I won't call you fellow South Africans. On my left is Paul Holden. Paul is by background a historian and archive, and is the Director of Investigations at Corruption Watch UK, a small organisation that I'm also a director at. Paul was the main author of this book, Indefensible: 7 Myths That Sustain the Global Arms Trade, which can be bought and read for free at a website called projectindefensible.org. Paul was also the lead researcher on this book, The Shadow World Inside the Global Arms Trade, which we published in late 2011. And on my right, although in no sense politically, is Anne Pettifor, and I couldn't give you even a brief summary of Anne's extraordinary resume, because it is so extensive, but simply to say that Anne is Director of Policy Research in Macroeconomics, a network of economists concerned with Keynesian monetary theories and policies, an honorary research fellow at the Political Economy Research Centre at City University, and a fellow of the New Economics Foundation in London. But perhaps one of the things that Anne is best known for is in one of many books, including The Coming First World Debt Crisis, she predicted the 2007-2008 global financial crisis. We couldn't have two better qualified people to look at the UK economy and the way forward for the defence sector in this economy. So Paul, to turn first to you. We hear a great deal about the contribution of the UK arms industry to the country's industrial base. And it would be fair to say that there's a widely held belief that the arms industry makes a major and key contribution to the UK's economic output, in particular its exports. So the implication of that is if we reduced arms exports, so if, for instance, we followed our own laws, if, for instance, we followed the EU common position, if, for instance, we honoured the International Arms Trade Treaty, and we did not sell weapons to countries that were actively engaged in conflict where civilians were likely to be put in harm's way, we would clearly reduce the impact of the arms industry in this economy. So, how much does it really contribute? And where do we go from here in terms of looking at a way forward with a reduced British arms economy?
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. First, I just want to say thank you to Lloyd's office for organising this event. It is both very distressing that an event like this needs to happen, but also very encouraging to see this number of people here. The second thing I should mention is that it feels, after a film like we've just watched, a little bit callous to speak about economic issues when there are such pressing human rights issues that need to be acknowledged. But I think the reason we are forced to is because the arms industry itself recognizes that it has effectively lost the moral argument. There is no moral argument for exporting arms to Saudi Arabia. And so it tries to muddy the waters. It tries to make it a different argument about the profound and powerful and absolutely central role that the arms industry is set to play in the UK economy. A good example of how that plays out in practice is actually around the corner from us. So I'm sure when some of you return home tonight, you'll take the tube from the Jubilee lines at the Westminster station. There's virtually no advertising in the Westminster station, very little. But there is an enormous banner advertisement that sits over the escalators as you go down the main escalator. The only advertising you see, and it's with BAE Systems. And BAE Systems aren't advertising security and peace, they're advertising the number of jobs they've created in the economy and how good those jobs are for the economy. So I think it's worthwhile to try and diffuse that. If there is an economic argument to be made, we should tackle it. And the sad reality is that it's a myth. The contribution of the UK arms industry is relatively small. I'd say there's three defining features of the UK arms trade. So the first is that it's smaller than the impression that is created in public, and certainly that's assiduously presented by both the MOD and by the arms companies themselves. The second thing is that it's heavily reliant, almost totally reliant, on massive government support and massive government subsidies. And then the third thing is that it's profoundly dysfunctional from an economic point of view, and it is very corrupt. So in terms of size, I should say there's a caveat, as Anna was mentioning earlier, there's a lot of data, but not a huge amount of information out there. So estimating the actual size of the defence economy in the UK is pretty difficult. But according to a July 2018 report that was put out by the MOD, in 2016 the total industrial turnover of defence manufacturing in the UK was £22 billion in 2016. Of that, £5.9 billion were in arms exports. Now, I should mention with arms exports, they vary in huge amount year to year because there are a number of very small number of very large contracts that when they're issued, they can change that figure quite drastically. But over time, over the last 10 years, arms exports have averaged around about £7 billion a year in the last 10 years. Now, let's put that in perspective. So, £22 billion of manufacturing has to be seen against total UK manufacturing turnover of £476 billion. So that means that the arms industry contributes 4% of all manufacturing in the country. Of that, only 1.2% is made up of arms exports. And I'd say probably half of that is made up of arms exports to Saudi Arabia and other states we shouldn't be exporting to. So relatively speaking, a very small segment of the economy. And that can be compared against other industrial sectors like pharmaceuticals, which contributes over £50 billion to the economy in terms of manufacturing. And in fact, to give a good estimate, I'm drawing from a much less well-intended talk that Lloyd gave. I'm giving him credit now, in case he approaches me afterwards to claim that I stole something from him. But the size of the arms industry in the UK is roughly equivalent to the size of the plastics industry, which has a turnover of about £34 billion, exports of £6.7 billion, roughly the same levels. And the reason I mention that is because I noticed today even there was an announcement that there's going to be a ban on single-use plastics of certain kinds. There's a widespread, well-supported and obviously well-founded campaign for reducing single-use plastics. At no time has anybody said, well, what about the plastics industry? Should we be worried about the jobs in the plastics industry? It seems to me that it's only in the arms industry that we have this bizarre schism where we move directly from a moral argument and an environmental argument to an economic argument. I should also mention that one of the big myths is that the UK arms industry is fundamental to growing the research and scientific knowledge base of the UK, that it contributes an outsized amount to research and development. The reality is, in 2017, there was £32 billion worth of civilian research and development investment and £1.8 billion of defence. So defence actually only contributes 5% to all R&D in the UK. Now the important thing to bear in mind there is that of that 1.8 billion figure, 1.168 billion is government funded. That's the government providing direct subsidies to private industry, which effectively owns this intellectual capital to conduct this research and development. It's an absolute fraction of what other industries like the pharmaceutical industry and the information technologies industries provide. So that's to give a sense of the size. Now the second feature that I think needs to be emphasized is that it is heavily reliant on government subsidies and support. The R&D figure I just gave is a very good example, but over 50% of all orders that are given to UK arms manufacturers are government orders. Effectively, the UK arms industry would cease to exist in its current form without that level of government support. And that's in addition to this vast architecture that's being created to support UK arms exports. There are up to 100 defence attaches around the world. There is a defence services export organisation with a massive staff. There is a series of export credit guarantees that are offered to potential buyers. There's a whole range of government agencies that actively support it. In 2018, SIPRI, which is the International Peace Research Institute, calculated that in 2016, between 104 and 110 million pounds was spent by the UK government in supporting arms exports, which were valued at 5.9 billion pounds at the time. This brings me to the last and the final feature, and I'll move on pretty quickly, is that the arms industry, from an economic point of view, is profoundly dysfunctional. And I always find this an interesting discussion when you have, particularly with people who lean to the right economically and politically, who usually defend the arms trade, is that on free market basis or economic efficiency basis, the arms industry makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So in the UK, for example, there is virtually no competition, or very little, or very limited competition for contracts. Between 2010 and 2015, over 48% of all UK arms contracts that were granted by the UK government were single source, non-competitive. There was no competition whatsoever for those contracts. BAE Systems, the single largest defence manufacturer in the country, received 89% of its contracts on a single source, non-competitive basis. Now you tell me, what sort of company in any other sector of the economy gets such favourable treatment from the UK government? And how on earth are you going to expect any company that's given that sort of treatment to deliver anything of value for money? The last thing I should mention, and it's probably something that Andrew will probably want to speak about a bit more, and it's almost the dirty secret that we haven't been talking about at all, is that the arms trade is profoundly corrupt, and it profoundly corrupts both the buying and the selling states. The most recent estimates that we have are that the arms trade contributes up to 40% of all corruption in all global trade, which is an absolutely astonishing figure. Now, in the UK, we've had multiple cases of major UK arms companies, BAE Systems, Augusta Western's Leonardo helicopters, Airbus at the moment being investigated, and Rolls-Royce, who had to reach a massive settlement with the SFO. All the major UK defence manufacturers have been involved in major corruption allegations over the last decade. That has a profound impact both on the security of our allies, but also on the economic argument. I mean, a lot of these contracts are being placed and being ordered by countries on a non-economic, non-need basis. The second thing is that this corruption corrupts, I would argue, the UK system. There is a massive system of revolving doors and establishment politics that allows the system to receive continued favourable treatment. And I believe that it's this system, this very small ecosystem, where you have people moving between the defence sector and the military, and the military and the defence sector, that creates a totally and utterly parasitic industry that seeks to undermine what I think most British citizens want, which is, at the very least, some degree of morality, some degree of rationality when it comes to exporting arms. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. It's worth considering, just on that last point in terms of corruption, that it's estimated that the arms trade accounts for around 40% of all corruption in global trade. And in addition to that, and I'm sorry to make this point as the only non-British citizen on the panel, on Monday, the former South African President Jacob Zuma appeared in court. He will be back in court in October to face trial on 16 charges, 783 counts of fraud, corruption and racketeering in relation to the South African arms deal. If we took the amount of money he actually received in relation to that arms deal probably amounts to around £20,000. On the Al-Yamamah arms deal between the United Kingdom and Saudi Arabia, around £6 billion of commissions were paid. The vast majority of what you and I understand as bribes. There has been zero legal accountability for the payment or receipt of £6 billion of bribes on one arms transaction. On that cheery note, and Paul has raised a whole range of issues touching on the economic side of the trade. I suppose a number of the counter-arguments would be, one, this is about national security and defense. Two, this is about jobs. And one would imagine that were Ian here with us this evening, we would talk about the likely impact on jobs, which raises issues of diversification out of the defense sector, conversion from the defense sector. Any thoughts you have on those issues?
Thank you very much. And can I just say that film was very difficult to watch, so thank you for showing it to us, because these are the consequences of what David Waring said about our image of ourselves, the British image of ourselves as this great imperial power, and having to maintain that image by having to maintain a military system and to bomb little children in Yemen is part of this image of grandeur of British power imperialism, which is now such a feature of the Brexit debate. It's quite extraordinary what is happening, and how diminished we look, must look, and do look in the eyes of the rest of the world, and yet we insist on this kind of military capacity. In answer to your question, first of all, I think Paul has covered most of the economics of the trade. Can I just correct one thing, which is that Paul said this was a subsidy, that the Export Credit Guarantee Department provides a subsidy to buyers. It doesn't. It provides a subsidy to the banks that finance the sales of armoured cars, of military kit, to the world's most wicked dictatorships. And I know about this because my background is in the degree of sovereign debt that built up amongst 35 of the poorest countries. We managed to persuade the IMF, the World Bank, and the Paris Club to write off about $100 billion of that debt in 2000, 2001, 5. But most of that debt was export credit guarantee debt. That is the real beneficiaries of that subsidy, and you're quite right. I mean, one of the arguments we have to make, I think, to win this case, is that this is free market economics really being ridiculed, and we can breathe because I know at the time we were working with the Export Credit Guarantee Department, that a lot of conservatives were very uneasy about the degree of subsidy being offered to exporters. If you grow tomatoes in Britain or anything else, you don't get a government subsidy. But if you grow something for export, you're given, and if you finance an export, if you're a bank, the government offers you something. So much for free market economics. And I think it's important for us to tackle this issue from that perspective, because it's a real vulnerability for the neoliberal right-wing economists. But I want to say this, yeah, and so yes, and so, you know, this industry is indefensible, really. But the point I really wanted to address tonight was this question of national security. Because we all have a government, and we all elect a government, and we have states. Because states can collectively provide us with security. Security that we cannot provide ourselves as individuals or even as communities. And yet I don't believe that our government and our state really cares about our security, because actually the biggest threat that we face at the moment, the most terrifying threat, is climate breakdown, is Earth systems breakdown. And I looked at the Government Department for national security, and I looked at what they prioritize as security issues, and it follows this order: terrorism, espionage, cyber terrorism, other threats, weapons of mass destruction, and organised crime. And sure, we want to be defended from all of those threats, but that's nothing compared to the biggest threat we face, which is that our children do not have a future. I hope you're all going to be on this demonstration Friday, when children in this country are going to come out and say we don't have a future, and our government is doing absolutely nothing about that. So I want to argue that what we could do with the defence industries is to say to the workers in those industries and the management, actually there is a lot of useful work you can do, and there is a lot of transitions that can be made where you can be using your skills that you've accumulated to actually do something far more important to our security, which is to help us deal with flood damage, with the coming droughts, with the fact that actually climate breakdown is going to lead to enormous global upheaval. And we're going to need to prepare for that. We're going to have to transition away from fossil fuels to more renewable energy. That is going to cost enormous sums of money, and I believe it's easily financeable, just as this kind of subsidy for military kit is affordable. But we're going to have to transition to renewable energy. And that's going to cost a great deal, but it's going to require enormous skills. And the really important thing about this transformation of our economy and our ecosystem that has to happen if we are to survive is that it's actually got to be a labor-intensive process. It's actually got to be a job-rich process. We have to, in my view, substitute labor for carbon. We're going to have to grow our own green beans. We're going to have to walk and cycle far more. We're going to have to sew our own clothes instead of relying on exploiting poor people in countries like Bangladesh and Africa. So there's an enormous amount of job creation that we'll be able to take with this transition to a more sustainable future. But what we just have to do is get off this great imperialist hobby horse of ours, on which we look so ridiculous right now. We're the laughing stock of the world because of our imperial ambitions. And I was born in South Africa. My great-grandfather fought in the Boer War. My great-grandmother spent some time in a concentration camp. So I know about British imperialism from the other end of the story. We've got to get over all that. It's no longer today's story. We need to think about more grave threats to our security, and we need to shift away from this kind of destructive economic spending to something that's more constructive. And the great thing about a rich job creation economy is that it creates income. If anyone who's had a job knows, when you get a job at the end of the month, you get income. And you use that income to repay any borrowing that you may have done, but you also use it to pay taxes. And those taxes go back to government to pay for the employment of more workers. And so investment in employment pays for itself, thanks to the multiplier. So we've got to overcome some of the profoundly damaging orthodox economics that lies behind the military industries and the destructive nature of those industries, and we've got to grow a more constructive economy, one that is going to prepare us for the greatest security threat we face, which is climate, which is Earth systems breakdown. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's worth bearing in mind that the biggest polluter on the planet is the US Department of Defense, the Pentagon. 25% of jet fuel used on this planet is used by military vehicles. So the connection between war, the arms trade, and the environmental Armageddon that we are facing is very clear and profound indeed. While we were researching the shadow of the book, I met with a senior executive from BAE Systems to give them the right to reply to some of the issues in the book. And the executive asked me to please bear in mind that they were producing a green bomb. So I said, oh, so you mean a bomb that will kill people, but in a way that is less harmful to the environment? And she said, yes, exactly. And just before we put in the final manuscript for the book, I phoned her back to check up on how the green bomb was going. And she couldn't really recall it. And eventually she said, oh, yeah, it was too expensive, so we forgot about that. The depth of challenges we face in this country with the nature of the arms trade, the political power of the arms trade in the United Kingdom for the very reasons that Anne has enunciated is something that we all need to consider. And as we move into the session in which we're going to ask you to do a bit of the work, I think it's really important to bear in mind that even in this room, and to reiterate the thanks for so many of you for being here, it really is great to see. There are some extraordinary organizations in the room. Campaign Against Arms Trade, Safer World, Amnesty International, and many others who I'm going to forget, and I apologize. And we've heard from Anna the remarkable work that she does on the arms export control system in this country should not be underestimated. So as we end this panel, I would really beseech each and every one of you to seriously consider getting yourselves involved in this issue. It is an issue that is critical to the future of the United Kingdom in the building of a more just, a greener economy in this country, in the development of a more just and a more peaceful foreign policy. And hopefully we can look to a period in the not too distant future where we understand the notion of human security in its very broadest terms. I'm going to hand over to Lloyd and just reiterate the thanks of this panel, both for the two of you and to Lloyd and his office for giving us this opportunity.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, when you and your colleagues came to me and we discussed this idea initially, and you said you wanted to do something on this, it immediately caught our imagination, and so I'm pleased that you came and we managed to do something. What we would like to do now is something a bit different. Normally in Parliament, we do lots of hearing from the front, and hopefully you've had some really fantastic speakers tonight who we are probably not worthy of some of the fantastic speakers we've had. But we want you to maybe make a deliberation now. And remind you, the first panel was to kind of set out what's maybe wrong with the arms criteria and how they're being judged or not judged. The second panel was to talk particularly about the situation in the Yemen. The third panel was to talk about economic issues. Now, whilst these are not actual considerations in the arms control system legally, the reason we've done that is because we actually believe what happens is time and time again, particularly because of the placing of the decision of the Department of Trade, it means that when the minister has to sign off that deal, and it's the trade minister, what's in their mind? Human rights? Or what's in their mind? What are the trade figures going to look like next year, next month? Our feeling is that what happens is economics often trumps rational criteria. So what we want you to do is in your tables, and you can see whether your table A, B or C, And in the agenda you can see what criteria you would look at. We would like you to have a short discussion in your table. While you're having that discussion, you can also, through those big double doors, we'll open them up, there's biscuits, there's tea and coffee, so you can come and get the biscuit, tea and coffee, have the discussion in the group. We'll give you about 10 to 15 minutes to have that discussion, and then we want you to feedback, and the decision is, on that criteria, what does, and this is the phrase not of me, this is the phrase of the head of the joint unit. What does your gut say? When he writes his memos to the minister, he says, my gut says that we should let it go through, or my gut says, in fact what he said is, my gut says that we should not sell any more weapons, and the minister overturned it. So we want to know what your gut says from listening to the evidence tonight and listening to the initial outline. And we hope that you'll come back, and at the end we'll have just a bit of a feedback going through each table, a sentence of what the table's gut says. So have some tea and coffee, and 10-15 minutes we will come back. Thank you.